Hi, I'm Zeinab Bailoun and this is Eco-Terrorism. When we look at a development proposal, we typically consider its possible effects. But do we look enough at the possible environmental effects? An environmental impact assessment, or EIA, does this, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Our guest in the studio is Ms. Racha, an EIA expert. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So before we start our discussion for today, let's take a look at this quick video before we start.
Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA as it's often called, is the environmental management process for the planning stages of the projects. And it's a key tool used by planning authorities and governments to make sure that environmental factors are brought into consideration in decisions alongside economic costs and benefits of a proposed development. The purpose of EIA is to provide an assessment of the potential impacts of a proposed development on the environment. This information can be used to anticipate the consequences of the development and then hopefully change decisions to improve sustainability outcomes. In this unit, we also trace the historical evolution of EIA and take an international perspective on it. We explain EIA, its various forms and functions, the steps involved in conducting an EIA process, and we especially emphasize the role of public participation in environmental impact assessment. As with any other environmental management tool, EIA also has its weaknesses and criticisms, and some of these are based around the following points. It neglects cumulative impacts, as projects are assessed on a case-by-case basis. EIA comes too late in the planning process. As an example, an EIA will only be triggered once the decision to build a road to alleviate traffic has been made. And this actually does discount any other alternatives we might have considered, such as public transport, to alleviate the traffic problem. The scope of EIA is often very site-specific, and indirect effects are ignored. It has a narrow spatial and temporal focus as well. And lastly, post-decision monitoring and auditing is a particular weakness in EIA because it's often neglected. We discuss these with a view to actually improving the practice of EIA so it can enable delivery of much more strategic, sustainable outcomes rather than looking at it as specific project-by-project basis.
So, Ms. Abou, to start for today, the International Association for Impact Assessment defines an EIA as the process of identifying, predicting, evaluating, and mitigating the biophysical, social, and other relevant effects of development proposals prior to major decisions being taken and commitments made. Would you say that this sums up what an EIA is specifically?
Basically, yes, an EIA is divided into different stages, but the main purpose of the EIA is to assess the environmental and social impacts of a proposed, and the keyword here is proposed project, where we propose mitigation measures for the negative impacts, and we search for mitigation measures also to enhance the positive impact of the environmental impacts.
Where does this typically happen? Or who takes initiative to begin such proposals?
Okay, usually the law obliges the investor or the client or any person who wants to start a project to conduct an EIA study prior to the construction of the project. Usually it comes at the early stages of the project during the planning phase, where the environmental team, which is composed of multidisciplinary team of experts, including engineers, environmental experts, social experts, hydrogeologists, geologists, which all together come to the conclusion whether the project is feasible, environmentally speaking, or not. So the law here obliges the investor to conduct the EIA study, so they have to do it.
Is this applicable in all countries across the
world? In all countries.
And how often does this happen? Is this something that every single proposal, every single project needs
Actually,
to
in each
happen?
country it's different. Usually the projects are fits into categories A, B, and C. This is the international standard. I'm talking about the World Bank standards, where projects that are listed under category A are the projects that have major environmental impact and need a full and detailed environmental impact assessment study. Usually the projects that have less impacts need an initial environmental examination or a preliminary environmental study. And the category C, usually the projects do not need any environmental studies. The impact would be very minimal and they do not require any environmental studies.
But how is it possible to measure such impacts? Is it possible to take account numerically or, how can you measure such an environmental impact of different projects?
This is actually based on pure judgment and experience of the professional who's conducting the study, but usually we look at the sources of environmental impact and the receptors. Let's say we have an industrial facility in the middle of nowhere, so the impacts would be very minimal since there are no sensitive receptors around the industrial facility. So usually we say that the impacts of this project are minimal. Let's say this industrial facility is to be constructed in the middle of Beirut city, which is a very dense residential populated city. Then the impact would be highly significant since the sensitive receptors are people. So this way you can measure the different magnitude of the environmental impact and be the judge of whether the project needs a full EIA or not.
How about the situation of EIAs in the Middle East and Lebanon specifically?
Actually, in the Middle East, EIAs are being very common. Almost each project needs an EIA, but in Lebanon it's different. The Ministry of Environment finally got the decree 8633 approved in 2012. And in this decree, the projects are listed under two categories, category 1 and 2. 1 are the projects which need a full detailed EIA study, and 2, the projects that need an initial environmental examination.
Comparable to the World Bank's classification.
Exactly. So each project in Lebanon basically needs either an EIA or an initial environmental examination.
And are these happening much more often than they were before?
Yes, of course, since the law requires it now.
What has been your experience with these EIAs?
In Lebanon or in
Lebanon.
General? In Lebanon, okay. I've had quite a few projects in Lebanon. Before 2012, we had no projects. After the decree got approved, now we have a lot of projects which require an EIA or an IEE. The Ministry of Environment is very stringent. They take everything very seriously, and they
Which is strange in Lebanon.
I know, but the Ministry of Environment is really working a lot.
And do you think this is a good thing?
Of course. We have to start spreading environmental awareness.
So let's say we move to talking about the different stages of EIA. The first one would be screening, which involves determining which projects or developments require a full or partial impact assessment study, which would fall under category 1 and category 2.
Exactly.
How does this happen? How is this determined?
Usually in Lebanon, the ministry determines this. We fill an application, we give it to the ministry, and then they decide whether the project needs an EIA or an IEE, based on the law, the decree issued. So in large-scale projects like industrial facilities, railways, highways, metros, resorts, they all need an EIA. And the projects like roads or a building or interchanges, they require only an IEE. So this is how we do the screening process.
Are there many incidents of type 1 projects or EIAs in Lebanon?
Yes, actually, there are.
Can you give some examples?
For example, a project that is being constructed above Beirut River, which is considered quite a sensitive environment for the aquatic habitats and aquatic ecosystem. So this needs a full and detailed EIA study. For example, resorts and compounds, which require the removal of forests and a huge number of trees, they require an EIA. These are examples from Lebanon. Or a highway, which goes through different municipalities from Beirut to Syria and other countries.
And all of these need EIA.
These are huge projects which need EIA.
We'll talk more about the future stages, the other stages of the EIA, right after the short break, so please stay tuned.
In the world of business, numbers tell truth. Investors seek startups and bankers provide loans. Stocks rise and fall. Traders anticipate shipments and cargo ships unload. But we at Etejah News spin the globe to bring you your weekly dose of business news.
Time. Variable. Events. The only constant variable in life is change. Broader perspective. Arguments and counter-arguments on our platform.
Global Insights. The globe on our platform.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking with Ms. Abou about the different stages of EIA's, environmental impact assessments. So we were on the second stage, which is scoping. And it's basically about identifying which potential impacts are relevant to assess based on legislation, international conventions, expert knowledge, different things like that. And identifying alternative solutions that can help biodiversity and basically conserve the environment in the best way possible. So what can you tell us about scoping, and how does the process how is it carried out?
All right, the scoping process is usually done to identify the major impacts that need further assessment in the full EIA study, and the impacts that need to be scoped out of the EIA study. For example, we're doing a project and there are no archaeological assets in the project site. So this is scoped out and we do not talk about it in the EIA study. Usually we put the laws and regulations, we find alternatives for the projects, and there are two types of alternatives, location alternative and technology alternatives, or alignment alternative. So usually we define these in the scoping process for further assessment in the EIA report. And we put preliminary impacts and mitigation measures, and finally we propose what is the environmental management plan that we are going to talk about in the EIA report.
Is it often that different proposals or projects are rejected or deemed unsuitable because of the environmental impact assessment?
Oh yes,
through scoping?
Of course. Only by the scoping stage. One project got rejected, and it was only in the scoping stage.
But it doesn't happen very often?
No, not really.
Especially in Lebanon, or would you say?
In Lebanon and very special cases.
So the third stage that we want to talk about is assessment and evaluation of impacts and the development of alternatives. And you were talking about location alternatives and different types of alternatives, although this falls under the second stage.
Yes.
But what can you say about this stage of the process?
This is the most important stage of the process. Actually, here in the EIA process, this is the basis of the EIA, where you talk about the project description, what are the technologies used, what are the laws and regulations in details, what are the environmental assessment based on different parameters like air, noise, water, social, biodiversity, archaeological. And finally, you put the mitigation measures, which should be cost-effective and feasible to alleviate the negative impacts of the proposed project. And here we have to talk about the alternatives. So basically, the environmental team or the EIA experts conducting the study have a say in changing the location or the technology or the alignment, if it was a road of the project, based on their assessment of the environmental impacts. So this is a very important stage. It could also stop a project from going on or get the approval on it. And finally, we put the environmental management plan, which is a neglected part of the EIA study in most of the countries in the world.
What are typically the factors that are weighed most in this stage? Would you say it's are costs talked about often? Is it more, specific environmental?
Not really. It's specific environmental and social considerations.
For example?
For example, let's say air quality. This is where we conduct air measurements. We go on field and we take measurements of the air quality, of the air pollutants present, so we can so we can then compare the impacts of the project once it's done, to compare it with the baseline conditions or the air measurements that we took at in the existing situation. So this is very important to set guidelines or standards to which we can compare or compare the results of the environmental impacts of the project.
Would you say some are given more weight than others, some factors?
Not really, they're all the same.
They're all considered equal?
Actually, based on the location. I mean, if there was a dry seasonal water course in the project site, this have less weight than if it was a heavy polluted site with air pollutants from industrial or traffic sources.
And of course, they also, when analysts are analyzing, the different possible impacts, they do look into the future as well. How far into the future these effects will carry on?
Of course, they're categorized into long-term and short-term, reversible, irreversible. So this is based on the magnitude of the impact and the if it's temporary or long-term.
So the fourth stage of the EIA process is reporting the environmental impact statement, or basically the EIA report overall, which includes an environmental management plan or an EMP and a non-technical summary for the general audience. What can you tell us about this part of the process?
This is the most important part. This is writing the report. The whole data collection process that you went through, whether the field measurement, the desk studies, all this is put into this report to construct the environmental statement report. So basically, also the environmental management plan. I want to talk about the environmental management plan, which is a summary of all the impacts that you have put into this report, the summary of the mitigation measures, the responsibilities of the different parties, the cost, and also the frequency of monitoring or managing the environmental impact. So this is very important part of the EIA study, which usually controls the environmental impacts or the project to alleviate the negative impacts on the environment.
So this is basically the part that the general public sees.
Exactly, or the contractor, when they want to construct the project, the contractor usually only looks into the non-technical summary and the EMP. That's it.
And this is basically what they use to decide what they're going to do.
Exactly, yeah.
So the stage afterward is basically the review of the environmental impact statement, and it's based on the terms of reference, which is the scoping, and public participation, including authority. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about public participation and about this stage in general.
Yes, public participation is a fundamental and essential element in the EIA process. I mean, when you involve the community, the affected community in a project, they will feel more involved. They will give you information about the environmental impacts that they see, about the potential mitigation measures, about the identification and selection of alternatives. I mean, the public opinion is usually taken really seriously, and they can stop a project from being constructed here. So it also allows the affected community to express their views about the project, give opinions. So it's actually it ensures that the EIA is transparent and open to all of the people.
Has it ever happened before in Lebanon, for example, that the public has been able to stop a project from
Actually,
coming
yes,
through?
yes.
Can you give us an example?
There was a project which was funded by an international organization, and we had to conduct public sessions where most of the affected municipalities were against the project. And this really stopped the project, and they didn't do it.
What was this project exactly?
It was a highway.
And
highway
it
that
would have
was
affected them in terms of...
dividing the village into two, creating islands between the different communities, and this really stopped the project. And
At what stage in the EIA process did this...
usually we started at the scoping stage, so we can include it in the EIA, and at the earliest stage.
So public participation also happens before this? Before the fourth stage? It's going throughout the process of the EIA in
exactly. Because the results of the public hearing should be included in the EIA report.
Okay. So the next stage in this whole process of the EIA includes decision-making on whether to approve the project or not and under what conditions. What can you tell us about the decision-making process and what factors are taken into consideration? Is it mainly the environmental impact statement that is considered? Are there other factors?
Usually this goes up to the Ministry of Environment. I mean, they are the decision makers whether to approve of the project, or to go on with the project, or to stop the project.
So it goes through the ministry first and then to the company?
Yes, they have to approve of the EIA study, and then they can go on with the project. And usually they look into different factors. Of course, the public participation is very important, and the major environmental impacts. If they are very major and the mitigation measures could not alleviate these negative impacts, they can stop the project, of course.
The final, or one of the stages, is also monitoring, compliance, enforcement, environmental auditing, which we want to talk about finally. And it's about monitoring whether the predicted impacts and proposed mitigation measures occur as defined in the environmental management plan. So this is basically, what can you tell us about this stage, this final stage in the whole process?
This actually stays a weakness of the EIA. I mean, no one really abide by the monitoring and compliance plan. It's to control the environmental impacts after the project is constructed or during the construction of the project. So let's say basically the contractor has to keep measuring the air quality, the noise, or take water samples, and on a regular basis. So they have to keep doing this to ensure that the project is not affecting the surrounding environment. And usually, I don't think this is being done or taken seriously here. And this also ensures that the affected or the actually involved community within the project site have the opportunity to make complaints if they are bothered or annoyed by the noise, or let's say the quantity of dust that is being generated or emitted by the project construction. And basically, it's a tool to control the environmental impacts and ensure that the project is being environmentally friendly and not affecting or harming the surrounding environment.
Can you tell us about the typical time it might take for each stage of an EIA?
This is really hard for each stage, but I can tell you an EIA may take up to 6-7 months.
So overall, as a kind of final question, how do you see the future of EIAs, looking into the future for Lebanon, for the Middle East, for the world? Do you think they will continue to be used, perhaps improved on?
Of course. I think they're an essential and a fundamental tool in each proposed project, that ensures that our environment is being protected and preserved and kept safe from any harming activities. And it's being really, it's now a trend in the world. So hopefully we'll go on and continue with preserving our environment by conducting the EIA studies.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to Ms. Abou for joining us in the studio, and to you for watching. That's it for today on Eco-Terrorism. See you next week.